Hello, all, and a warm welcome to the Roundtable conference of the Nickel and Dimed, which is the official research and publication platform for the Center for New Economic Studies. We are the members of the Gender and Societies cluster, and joining me today are panelists Anushka and Rohan, and the conference will be moderated by myself, Sashank. So in the recent past, a seemingly harmless and somewhat positive form of sexism has emerged, which is called as benevolent sexism. It kind of emphasizes the traditional beliefs and superstition that women are delicate, precious, and they need to be protected. It places men on this higher citadel that they need to be chivalrous and that men and women need chivalry. But in the recent decade, in the recent times, following the call for a more inclusive society, we realized that benevolent sexism is also very prevalent and need to be taken seriously. And on that front, we'll be discussing the effects of benevolent sexism in today's age and time, and what could be done to eradicate it or reduce it to a larger extent in today's society. So just moving on, we all know about hostile sexism, right? And explicitly resentful and bad attitude towards women and all. But can we say that hostile sexism has been replaced by benevolent sexism in the recent times? What do you guys think? Or is there any correlation between the two? Anybody?
Sure, I could go first. So, I mean, the idea that, that hostile sexism and benevolent sexism are just like very different from each other is, it's not so. I would say there exists like a very fine line between these two theoretical frameworks, and they sort of stem from the same framework known as ambivalent sexism, right? And that explains itself that this both of these stems of sexism are very ambivalent, and there's no certain difference that you can like actually make out. So while like hostile sexism is easier to like identify because of its overtly negative stereotyping of women and things like that, I don't think benevolent sexism is very separated from it in that sense. And I mean, I would argue that even historically, although like with the growing social media culture and things like that, we tend to think that, the more hostile forms of sexism has been replaced by benevolent sexism. I mean, social media is sort of replete with like examples of sexism, right? And so a very popular one, which I could think of for right now, would be Andrew Tate. This, I think like a social media celebrity who does a lot of like, podcasts and things like that. And he regularly holds podcasts which tap into themes of like relationships between men and women. And his views in many regards are seem to be intrinsically like hostile towards women. But you would also find him explaining them through like logic of finances and culture and need to protect women's dignity, which are, features of benevolent sexism. But at the same time, like his views about women are also like quite hostile, and the viewers and like the younger audience who sort of gets influenced by these things you know tend to actually troll women and cause really hostile behavior online. So like I don't think there's a very it's not very different in that sense. And I mean, to some extent maybe it's hostile sexism is much more disguised, but one can cause the other very easily, and that is quite visible on social media, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. Rohan, is there anything that you would like to add here?
Not much. I think Anushka made the main points quite succinctly, but to add my own 2 cents to it, I do find benevolence sexism to have a slightly more positive side to it than outright straight up misogyny or misandry. But um, this idea that we idolize a particular gender and then put them in a box and then refuse to let you know individuals be individuals, whether it's men or women. It's definitely harmful towards society, and the less we try and force men and women to act like archetypes, the better and freer our societies will be. So that's my my contribution to the first question.
I mean, yeah, that's true. And as Anushka said as well, because it comes from this ambivalent sexism as a whole, whenever we talk about benevolent sexism, hostile sexism always plays in the background. It's always there. It's just that it's another form that has come into place, and another picture that is now still in the society. And that kind of leads to the second question as well. So we saw that because it has its basis on hostile sexism, that is, reinforcing the traditional norms as well. That is now, but what would be the effects of benevolent sexism? We saw that it kind of gives you this positive, so-called positive effects, but what does it actually impact on women or any other genders that actually victimizes it? What are the impacts for it? Anybody would like to go ahead with that?
Yeah, I think, well, we can't outright dismiss the whole topic with the whole discussion around, how exactly should we treat people of a particular gender? How should, what exactly is the role of men and women in society? And this idea that traditional roles are somehow completely toxic altogether, and that we must dismiss them outright, is, in my opinion, certainly a very, very haphazard and sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater way of looking at tradition, which I'm not a fan of. We have to take tradition seriously because it exists for a reason. These traditions that have existed for thousands of years have kept societies going since the dawn of human civilization. So we can't dismiss tradition. What we have to look at more clearly is what is the harm being what is the harm being caused by these traditions. What is the after effect of particular types of traditions? We have to look at it with a fine-tooth comb, which is where the concept of benevolent sexism comes from in the first place. When we discuss benevolent sexism, we aren't talking about overall, malevolent behavior. We are talking about minor, not minor, but nuanced, everyday behavior, which snowballs into much larger negative effects over time, which again goes back to the argument, to the conversation we had in the previous question about forcing men and women to act as archetypes of masculinity or femininity, and dismissing the individual and their needs, which again has a massive snowball effect in Indian society. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I find it interesting that you mentioned, the traditional aspect of it, and how for thousands of years this sort of tradition has been going on. That also sort of, I think, can make us question if benevolent sexism or hostile sexism as such have always been such isolated things, or have they always existed in this sort of ambivalence? That because, like, taking maybe like the Indian culture, for example, I can think of like the Arcadian paradigms where, women are elevated to the position of goddesses. The nation becomes the mother, Bharat Mata, and which needs to be protected by her sons. So ultimately, our body is becoming the zone of war, quite hostile in DMT. But at the same time, that's also, showing benevolent sexism, because you are putting the woman on a pedestal and she's someone who we worship. So it's evident through, I feel like, histories and photos, popular media, that this trope has sort of existed for a long time. It's not something, which is a very capitalist sort of a product of like workplace interactions or things like that. It's something which has always existed. Sometimes both the same person can exhibit like both sorts of behaviors, like benevolent sexism and hostile sexism at the same time without realizing it. So, and sexism inherently means like harboring a sort of bias, right, towards one gender. So, like if treating one gender as superior to the other or inferior to the other. So it does perpetuate gender inequality in that sense. But even like under the guise of like elevating the position of women, as Rohan said earlier, what it does is sort of like it's sort of very exclusionary. It isolates them and puts them in a box where, they are dehumanized in a way. So how much of a positive effect does it have? Exactly.
Yeah, that's actually true. Like you guys, I mean, Rohan also talked about how those, these nuanced kind of behavioral changes actually snowballs into an effect. And you also touched upon how it actually kind of becomes this indicator of gender inequality as such as a whole. And yeah, that's actually even like backed by research as well. We see that where societies where, benevolent sexism is very, very prevalent, we see that at least, when we just see as binaries, male and females, males also have better literacy rates, better healthcare, their lifestyles are better, they have better job market, especially when it comes to the income differences between them. So that it kind of affects it. And again, that again leads to the next question as well. If we all agree that benevolent sexism has these effects and has these negative effects, what makes it actually difficult to identify it? Normally, if something has if something is kind of bad, you're able to immediately tell it, okay, this is bad because of these reasons and all. But even after looking at the reasons and what benevolent sexism can actually cause, what makes it actually difficult to identify and point out, okay, yeah, this is happening and this needs to be stopped?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it goes back to the definition of this sort of sexism itself, where it's a positive evaluation of women. And, examples of this would be, as previously discussed, like reverence of women in the traditionally gendered roles of like being a wife, being a caretaker for the children, a mother, as a heterosexual romantic partner. So, belief. And so I feel like these ideal types are what exactly, and like they are obviously portrayed as something which is very positive, and there are no overtly negative things attached to this sort of evaluation. And there is an interesting piece by, I might pronounce the name wrong, Melanie Tanbaum in the Scientific American on this, and it's titled "The Problem When Sexism Just Sounds So Darn Friendly." So I feel like that completely explains why it's so hard to just identify this issue, because how do you respond to a compliment at a workspace where you're being, where you work on a project and you're being complimented on your attractiveness, or that your hair looks nice, your dress looks great. So, things like that. Then how do you find something wrong with that? So like, even if you're supposed to receive these compliments graciously, or as like the negative stereotypes of women being overreacting, being over emotional, the sort of things that we associate with hostile sexism seem to be referred to these women. And even I could think of like, so as I said, like there's so many examples in popular culture of this. So like even like the popular media tropes and like, the pop culture tropes of the cool girl, where, like I'm not like the other girls are, it's frequently ridiculed nowadays, where on social media, where, a lot of women in their teenage years and when they were growing up as adolescents, they go through a phase where they're like, I'm not like other girls, where you start, and like soon you started to realize that, they were conforming to these set ideas constructed by patriarchy, which favored this sort of a trope. And also, like Gone Girl, the famous book has, and the movie has like a very famous monologue about the cool girl, which perfectly encapsulates like the traps of such expectations which are put upon women. So even though, it's something which is sort of bringing down the value of women, we also sort of conform to these ideas at some space and without realizing it. And it's, quite late when you realize that this is a form of casual sexism, which, yeah, it's just because it's so friendly, you don't really realize it. And because it's not so overtly hostile against women, there's no, overt hatred that's been portrayed. You can't really identify it. And the consequences of it are felt much later on.
Yeah, Rohan. Yeah, Rohan, go ahead.
Yeah, this is where I start to deviate, because I feel we are very quickly veering into the white Western feminist doctrine, and this discussion is beginning to be bottlenecked. We have to when we talk about benevolent sexism, we aren't talking about a lighter shade of just regular plain old sexism. Benevolence benevolent sexism is unique in the fact that it actually has positive benefits towards both genders, along with the negative. For example, statistically attractive conventionally attractive women are much more likely to be hired above men, and conventionally unattractive people in general, which again is benevolent sexism. You are not hiring someone based on their merit, but based on how they look. On the other hand, men get higher salaries, and alongside the higher salaries, more hours of work assigned to them by virtue of them being men. So it's just assumed that we as men will always be willing to work much more with, without asking for our opinion first, which then goes back to the whole conversation around paternity for men alongside maternity leave. There are pros and cons to benevolent sexism, which again, the benevolent part of benevolent sexism, there are positives and negatives to the whole thing. And I have an issue with the word patriarchy altogether, because I feel like it's an overt simplification of a very complex problem. We can't just it's like the word patriarchy seems to be a complex problem. And it's a different type of problem with different shades in different cultures in different countries. You can't just call it the patriarchy and be done with it. Benevolent sexism has its detriments for both genders, and it goes far beyond simply being called the office. For example, look at the mandatory military draft which existed in most countries throughout human history. That is also a form of benevolent sexism, where we assume men will just automatically be in the protected roles. So we mandate military service for them for the longest time. We have debated whether the draft should be extended to women as well, or should we get rid of the draft altogether. That is a very relevant conversation being had around benevolent sexism. So I don't think pigeonholing this whole conversation around white Western feminist doctrine is going to help. We need to look at it from a much more holistic basis, and we need to look at it from the point of view of different cultures, different countries, different religious backgrounds, who invariably disagree with white Western feminism. For many feminists outside of the West, the word patriarchy doesn't work for them. We need to find more fine finer, more well thought out solutions than simply laying all the blame on one nebulous monolith called the patriarchy, which even the feminists have a hard time defining.
Yeah.
Okay, can I respond to that? Yeah, am I audible? Okay. Yeah, I mean, this definitely putting forward a point of view where I think we agree on this, that, benevolent sexism has both its advantages and disadvantages. And as you mentioned, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned that, that it's a very white feminist perspective, or like a very Western perspective on sexism when we look at workplace mismanagements like that, or like misconducts, because, it's also a very modern problem relevant to South Asia and places other than the West in that sense. And as you said, about the military and the men being drafted, those are very valid concerns, and, clearly show that there are negative setbacks on it for like different genders differently. But, that sort of does not negate that there is a problem, which I don't think a woman getting promoted to a higher level, to a higher position than a man just because of their attractiveness is not just one of the aspects of this sort of sexism. There also, that too is very nuanced, where a lot of workplace sexual misconduct and other issues like that come up because of these things. It's very subtle gestures, and when I'm talking about these compliments and things like that, they can also, very easily veer towards some sort of like misconduct and making people uncomfortable in that sense. What I meant by that is like, that women would not always want to be just put into a box where they are portrayed according to their attractiveness or things like that. That is certainly not something, even though if it is an advantage, and I'm not talking about all women, it can be very subjective, but like overall, it can also relate, like it tends to address a lot of other problems as well for women. So yeah, I mean, when I was talking about patriarchy, I didn't think too much of it. And I wasn't trying to, it was in a much more general sense. I feel like we do tend to use a lot of words from the
I think we have. Anushka's having some
conduct is.
issues. Oh yeah, she's back. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna switch off my video. Sorry.
Yeah.
Wait, I think my internet connection is unstable. Yeah. So like when I talked about like the negative aspects of benevolent sexism, that is what I meant. That, obviously maybe some positives do exist for women. I completely agree on whatever you talked about, Rohan. But there are also like these are also very real problems which exist because of benevolent sexism, where women are sort of put into a box and, sometimes not taken seriously. So I think there's both good and bad to it, and it's much more complicated than just looking at one point of view.
One of the issues we have come up with over the last few decades, ever since the second half of the 20th century, where women en masse joined the workforce, has been the problem of not paying them enough, working them way too much, and basically forcing them into an exploitative relationship with the corporate world, or any other the kind of workplace. This is to add to Anushka's point, one of the aspects of benevolent sexism as well, where we assume that women will be too agreeable to want to negotiate for higher salaries, so we don't even give them the option to negotiate in most cases. I'm finding out to this day with female friends of mine who are having a hard time negotiating for higher salaries and better working conditions. So it definitely happens to this day too. And I never meant to dismiss your point about the workforce, about workplace harassment or anything else like that. But it's definitely a valid point. I think we should I think the whole discussion around benevolent sexism gets a little muddled because overwhelmingly, it's a little bit harder to define than traditional, shall we say, sexism, which is obviously existed. The problem we find with benevolent sexism is that it's rooted in gender roles which at one point were necessary for the evolution of civilization, but now are completely out of place in the modern world, where we don't really need to fit into those archetypes anymore, and it just built off of there. The further more advanced we got into society, the more of our biases got revealed. So it's definitely a problem.
Yes, statement. So, and we see that, because of the prevalence of benevolent sexism and how it actually affects like both the genders, we also need to like think about what could be done. Probably it might be easier said than done, but probably need like some kind of psychological intervention. Both is education. Both men and women need to be educated about the insidious consequences that benevolent sexism might have, and probably, as you said, because it affects both the genders here, both of them need to have understand benevolent sexism's oppressive nature, even though it has these positive impacts, and kind of develop some kind of a sympathy. And even Anushka actually brought it up in her point when she said that it's the problem is when it's so damn funny. I mean, friendly. Sorry. It's when we also need to kind of learn how differentiate between when it is benevolent sexism and when it's like a genuine compliment. And if you're trying to, it's a fine line that we kind of try to go by, but that distinction is very important, because sometimes genuinely it would be a good compliment, but at the same time it would have this benevolent sexism embedded in it, and that is why, and that is when
Shashank, I think your voice is lagging. It's Ashoka internet again.
no, the what I was
think
trying
the connection throughout the discussion as a whole has been pretty bad.
what I was trying to kind of tell is that we need to draw a line between compliments, genuine compliments, and where benevolent sexism is, and we need to probably call them out when benevolent sexism actually exists and when it's like a normal compliment. Apart from educating both parties, or probably even everybody, we are only talking about binaries here. What about the other genders as well? They might also face some kind of benevolent sexism, right? So we all need to kind of work on that aspect. And I think that is like the most important way wherein we can address benevolent sexism and kind of go forward as a more inclusive society. That brings us to the end of the conference, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Despite the internet connection issues, it was a very, very fruitful conversation, and I felt it was something very new, yet a kind of very, very important discussion that we had among us. Thank you so much for joining again.